Hi, I'm Mark David Gerson. Welcome to Stories and Reflections, where my stories are also yours. Last week, I talked about the anniversary of a death, my mother's. This week, I want to talk about the anniversary of a birth, the birth of my first book. Bizarrely, both happened in the same week, although a decade apart. My mother, as I mentioned last week, died in March 1984, and the MoonQuest, my first book, my first novel, happened to me in March 1994. I said happened to me, and I'll explain in a bit what I mean by that. First, though, isn't it bizarre that the birth of the MoonQuest occurred exactly 10 years and 2 days after my mother's death? The metaphysical part of my nature has often wondered whether there's a connection, whether the spirit of my mother, not a writer, but a voracious reader, somehow fed the idea of my first book to me from whatever otherworldly place she then inhabited. Or if she didn't directly feed it to me, whether she was somehow involved in the creative process that birthed it within me. In a world filled with mysteries, I guess this is going to have to remain one of them. I don't know, and frankly, I can't know. Still, it's definitely curious, especially given the unusual way the story showed up in my life. Happened to me, as I said before. Let's call it what it was. It was magical, a sort of miracle even. And that isn't the only magical miracle associated with this book. And I'll talk about a few today, starting back in March 1994. A few weeks ago, I shared how I came to start teaching, and if you missed it, you'll find that story in episode 11. For the purposes of today's telling, though, let's just say that if the call to teach hadn't shown up how and when it did, there might not even be a MoonQuest. So March 1994. Maybe it was even March 26th, which would make it the exact 10-year anniversary of my mother's death. After all this time, I can't be absolutely certain of that. But if it wasn't the 26th, it was pretty close. So it's March 26th-ish. I'm living in Toronto then, and I'm in the posh Yorkville neighborhood downtown, having just left my naturopath's office. The only reason I mention him now is that his office was around the corner from the Omega Centre, which was then Toronto's premier metaphysical bookstore. And I would often pop in there before or after my appointment, which is what I did on that March day, on or around March 26th. And as I was browsing, a tarot deck caught my eye, the Celtic Tarot, with art by Courtney Davis. It wasn't that I had a particular interest in tarot decks or any kind of oracle decks. I didn't own any, and I had no interest whatsoever in doing readings, especially not tarot readings, because then I would have to learn what each card meant. Nor had I yet become fixated on the Fool card, which would later become such a defining archetype for me and would become the inspiration for my 4 Way of the Fool self-help books. All I knew was that that particular deck was calling to me. But was it calling to me enough for me to spend $35 on it? Especially when I wasn't interested in either giving or getting tarot readings? Hell no. So I replaced the deck on the shelf and left the store. But I'd barely set foot back on the Yorkville Avenue sidewalk when I turned around and made my way back into the bookstore and to the tarot bookcase. So I pulled it down, studied it some more, returned it to its shelf, and again left the store. I don't remember how many times I repeated that cycle before finally surrendering to that intuitive inner knowingness that then in those days was still fairly new to me, and I didn't trust it nearly as much as I do now. Still, when I got the deck home and opened it, I had no idea why I'd bought it. The art was stunning, certainly, and its Celtic imagery was arresting, and I was very into Celtic things back then. I still am. But what was I supposed to do with it? I still felt no call to study tarot and certainly not to give any readings. So I set it aside and got on with my day. So now it's March 28th, a few days after my Omega Center experience. And I'm getting ready to prepare for that evening's writing class. Like the Sunday Writes workshop series I offer these days, that series of classes was less about teaching and more about guiding participants into writing through a guided meditation, visualization, or other exercise. So I settle into my favorite armchair and shut my eyes in meditation, fully expecting the evening's theme or topic to emerge from the experience, as it has before. Yet when I open my eyes a while later, I still have no compelling program. What am I going to do? Then I notice the Celtic Tarot, which has been sitting across the room since I brought it home from the Omega Center bookstore. And just like in those old comic strips, a light bulb flashes over my head. Here's what I'll do. I'll have each student draw, closed-eyed, one of the deck's cards, one of the deck's major arcana cards. Then, with their eyes open to the chosen card, I'll lead them through a guided visualization into writing. And that evening is exactly what I did in my living room in Toronto's High Park neighborhood. Now, I rarely write during a workshop I'm facilitating. Instead, I watch the participants, hold space for them, and remain available to them. But this March 28th class would be different. Once everyone was writing, some inner imperative, the voice of my muse maybe, insisted that I also pick a card. So I closed my eyes, reached into the deck, and pulled a card. It was the Chariot. And then, without full awareness of what I was doing, I picked up my pen, pulled my yellow page notepad toward me, and began to write. What emerged after a rambling preamble was the tale of an odd-looking man in an odd-looking coach, and pulling the coach were horses as oddly colored as those on the card. That scene would become the opening of the first draft of a novel I had no conscious desire to write and knew absolutely nothing about. Next morning, for reasons I can't even tell you, I picked up the untitled story where I'd left off and continued writing. And I did that every morning for the next 4 months. Not without stress, lots and lots of stress. Remember, I knew nothing about this story I was writing, and I only discovered the story word by word and sentence by sentence as I wrote. And worse, because it was fantasy, the story didn't even have to make conventional sense, which it sure as hell didn't. So for the control freak that I was back then, it was crazy making. And like I said, it was so stressful that I ended up forcing myself to write every morning in bed before getting up. I figured that if writing was the first thing I did, I wouldn't spend the rest of my day trying to avoid doing it. Now it's a technique I often recommend to students and coaching clients who have procrastination issues. I certainly then had procrastination issues with this book, with this story that so terrified me. Well, this went on for 4 months, as I said, and I won't go into the whole story today, at least, about how and why I left Toronto for Nova Scotia. But it was when those 4 months were up that I felt the call, the powerful, strong, unavoidable call to sell everything I owned and move 1,000 miles east to Canada's Atlantic coast. 5 months of upheaval and resettling would pass before I got back to work on my story, on this book. Now, I still didn't have a title, and I still had no clear idea of the plot, but I also had no distractions. That's because in late 1994 and early 1995, the world had no internet and no smartphones. On top of that, I wasn't living in a city or even in a small town. I was living in a rural community where I knew no one. I had no TV, my radio picked up only one AM station, and I hadn't given my phone number to anyone back in Toronto. So once I picked up the book again, there was nothing much else for me to do but write. And so I did. And on March 28, 1995, bizarrely, a year to the day from that Toronto class, I completed my first draft. It was a rambling, repetitive mess of a draft. But at least I now knew the story, and finally, I had a title. And today, 31 years later from finishing that first draft, 32 years after the book birthed in that Toronto writing class, the MoonQuest has won 6 literary awards. It's garnered glowing, effusive reviews and critical acclaim. And it has spawned a series, The Legend of Quintana, a series that was as unexpected, at least to its author and creator, as the MoonQuest had been that March evening in my Toronto flat. Magic? Absolutely. Here's the next piece of magical miracle. In 2002, I got an agent. Never an easy thing to do with a first book. But that isn't really the magical miracle I'm talking about, because Nancy, as much as she loved and believed in the MoonQuest, never managed to find it a home with a publisher. And so ultimately, I decided to publish it myself, or perhaps more accurately, the story insisted that it was time to go public. And if I couldn't attract another agent or publisher on my own, I needed to publish the book myself. Now, self-publishing was way more complicated back then, but that too is a story for another day. Because the magic I want to talk about next has to do with the book's cover. Not the current cover, which is the MoonQuest's third cover over the years. The first one. I won't name the cover designer here because we had a very prickly relationship almost from the start. But what she produced in the end was astounding. Now, if you're watching this on video, you'll see side-by-side illustrations of the Celtic Tarot Chariot card and that first cover, and you'll notice the similarities. The horses on the cover, for example, are the identical, unusual colors of those on the card. So this is how they're described, the horses are described in the book. But for the white bolts that flashed from forehead to muzzle, Rika's coloring was the pale blue of morning sky, Tar's the smoky plum of twilight. And of course, those colors came from the chariot card from the tarot deck. Now you'll notice that the horses on the cover, the first cover of the first edition of the MoonQuest, are also in the same positions as those on the card and the exact same colors. There's even a tiny, tiny chalice on the card. If you look closely, you'll see it just above the letters H and E in the for the MoonQuest. And before you say that the cover designer must have adapted her illustration from Courtney Davis's card, you have to know that I never told her about the card or the deck, and she didn't have a metaphysical bone in her body. She would have known nothing about tarot cards, and she wouldn't have happened upon the deck on her own. On top of that, I didn't even have a copy of the deck anymore. I'd gifted mine to a tarot reader friend when I'd left Toronto. Yet somehow, the same energy that inspired my story also inspired her design. Now that's magic. Fortunately, I did manage to replace my copy of the Celtic Tarot a few years back, which wasn't easy, as the deck has been out of print for a whole bunch of years, and that's really too bad because it's a terrific deck. Now, I talked about the book and how it came to be, but I haven't shared anything about the story, and that's where even more magic has manifested. First, you have to remember that the story found me in 1994 in Canada, that I wrote most of it in rural Nova Scotia, and that its plot and themes were in place before I came to the US 3 years later. Nothing about the story or its themes was based on current events then or now, or on political realities in any country then or now. I had no agenda when I was writing it, political or otherwise, other than to get out of my own way and let this strange, surprising story tell itself through me. So let me tell you about that story and how it's, well, so magical. Not in a fantasy genre sort of way, but in the fact that it's even more relevant today than it was when I started writing it 32 years ago. Imagine a land so brutalized by its tyrant king that even speaking or writing the words "once upon a time" got you jailed or killed. Imagine a people so brutalized by that king and by his army of masked thugs that they're not allowed to dream, not allowed to imagine, not allowed to tell stories, not allowed to think freely for themselves, not allowed to speak freely. Imagine a censorship so complete that on the king's orders all books have been seized. Imagine that all that's permitted by the king are facts, not verifiable facts, but the facts he decrees to be true. Imagine not being able to challenge the facts decreed by the king, because without imagination there's no wisdom. Without imagination, there's no discernment. And imagine that behind that tyrant of a king, controlling that tyrant of a king, is a shadowy figure even more evil than he is, even more cruel and heinous than he is. Imagine a land so stripped of vision that even imagining these things could have you branded a traitor and executed. That's the situation in Quintana, the mythical land where the MoonQuest takes place. Now, if any of this triggers even vague parallels with current events, you'll understand the magic I'm talking about. Because everything I just described was, as I said, not only conceived more than 30 years ago, it was conceived by someone, me, living in a different country. And more than that, I was living largely in retreat as something of a hermit, mostly disconnected from the world and its news. And I was definitely no kind of soothsayer able to predict the future. But here's the thing. I may not have been prescient, but my story was. The MoonQuest was. You know, when the book first came out, that was in 2007, I was often asked whether I'd written the MoonQuest as some kind of metaphor for the then political situation in the US. And off and on in the years since, all the way up to today, I have been asked the same question, and not only in the US, about the US. I often talk about how my stories are smarter than I am, but how they know themselves better than I ever can. And that isn't just about me. Whenever we write from the heart, from those deepest places within us, whenever we get out of the way of those stories that want to be told through us, our stories are always smarter, more compelling, more evocative, and yes, more prescient than we are, than we ever could be. That is the magic of storytelling. That was and remains a big part of the magic of the MoonQuest. Like all stories written or told from those deep, authentic places within us, the MoonQuest is a story that transcends time and place, a true fantasy for our time and all times. And today, as I recall and celebrate the strange and yes, magical story of its birth 32 years ago, I'm grateful, supremely grateful, that that story chose me to bring it into the world. Thanks for joining me for Stories and Reflections today. I hope you found moments in my stories that touched something in yours. If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And for more of my stories and help telling yours, check out my books at markdavidgerson.com or from online booksellers worldwide. Until next time, don't forget that you're a storyteller too, and keep telling your stories. The intro and outro music for today's episode is Heartwarming by Kevin MacLeod from Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons.